I've been heartbroken to hear the stories of parents searching for formula. As a mom and a nana, it's impossible to hear the stories of children suffering and not imagine your own children in the same position. Food is the first and most important way we nurture our children. Joe and his team have put solutions into place to get formula back onto the shelves.
The Biden administration airlifts over 1 million baby formula bottles from Europe as the U.S. struggles to fill a nationwide shortage amid a growing political and public health crisis. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Ghida Fakhry. In recent weeks, shortages of baby formula across the United States have evoked scenes not normally associated with the wealthiest country in the world. Facing fierce criticism for not moving earlier to address the problem, the Biden administration invoked the Defense Production Act of 1950, which Congress passed in the early days of the Korean War, in an attempt to speed up domestic production while also using military and commercial aircraft to deliver formula from abroad. Now, some states have reported acute shortages of up to 90%, as parents have resorted to supplementing with other types of milk, sometimes with adverse effects for infants. The shortage is the result of a confluence of factors: the shutting down of one of the largest formula manufacturing plants in the US due to concerns of contamination, supply chains that have been disrupted by the COVID-19 pandemic, labor shortages, and import tariffs designed to protect US manufacturers. The head of the U.S. Food and Drug Administration, the FDA, has predicted it will take 2 months for the U.S., which normally produces 98% of the formula it consumes, to return to having a surplus of formula. In the meantime, some of the most vulnerable Americans continue to face major challenges. Many families rely on the federal government's Women, Infants and Children program, which provides more than 50% of all formula purchased in the United States, much of it subsidized in order to help lower-income families. One of the mothers who've been severely impacted by the formula shortage is TiffanyAnn Goodson of Mocha Moms, an advocacy group for mothers of color. TiffanyAnn Goodson, you have been directly affected by the baby formula shortage. Tell us about the impact it's had on you and your 8-month-old daughter, Jade.
Well, Ghida, first off, thank you so much for having me today and giving me the platform to speak about this. As you said, I have been directly impacted by the formula shortage. I have a baby, a sweet baby Jade. She is 8 months old, and she was born with a growth restriction. Unfortunately, that means my daughter, who is 8, almost 9 months, is the size of a 3-month-old, and she requires not a specialty brand of formula, but a greater concentration of typical store-bought formula. She's on an organic, sensitive brand that works best for her. And unfortunately, this shortage has made it incredibly difficult to find the formula that we need. 1 can of formula, like a 23-ounce can, only lasts my daughter about a week. And so as you can imagine, this formula shortage is projected to last until July before shelves are normal. And so every week that goes by, I'm a little bit nervous about how she's going to get fed.
And are the prospects getting any better given the fact that the Biden administration has invoked the Defense Production Act and that they airlifted hundreds of thousands of bottles from Europe?
And while I appreciate what the Biden administration is doing to help curtail this crisis, unfortunately, it has not yet trickled down to my local supermarkets or grocery stores. I'm from Maryland. While I reside in Maryland, haven't seen it in anywhere near me. I have family members in the Northeast. They haven't seen it on their shelves either. I have colleagues as far as Dallas looking, family friends as far as Wyoming, and they're not able to find very many cans at a time, if at all.
It's been a huge problem for so many parents across the country. I know you were invited to the White House for a meeting on the baby formula crisis. Through your organization's Mocha Moms, you said that you wanted to know why antitrust regulations hadn't prevented a virtual monopoly that puts nearly 90% of infant formula production in the hands of just 4 corporations. You also said you wanted to know why one of the main four manufacturers got away with not prioritizing safety protocols. Did you hear anything that satisfied you and answered your questions?
So I've been a very staunch advocate on this issue and just really trying to get down to why moms and families in this country have not been supported better throughout this crisis. The comments that you referenced were in an op-ed that I had written at the White House. It was a Zoom virtual meeting. I asked about just the Defense Production Act and if this could have been employed sooner, and if we could post-mortem, if you will, the crisis to understand why, this hadn't been employed at a sooner date to make sure that we could alleviate the pain that many families are feeling.
Did you get the answers you were hoping for?
Unfortunately, I wouldn't say I got a complete answer. They were able to say that they had taken additional measures before employing the Defense Production Act. They thought that those measures would work best. And they said that they had met with formula makers and retailers, and that the actions that they had taken prior to instituting the Defense Production Act should have been more meaningful. But at this point, as the crisis continued, they are employing all levers.
But who do you hold most responsible for what has happened? I know you've criticized politicians and elected officials for looking away, while monopolies, you say, undercut food safety. Who do you hold responsible? The federal government, the FDA, the corporations themselves?
To be honest, right, I think when you're a citizen in a society that there are many things at play. And so I hold a little bit of all of us, responsible, right? I hold myself and responsible in the sense that, right, I consider myself to be an active citizen, but it really took this issue and literally taking food out of the mouth of my baby before I really got riled up and really started to hold into account the FDA, the government, the formula makers. So I think everybody is at fault a little bit in this, right? Not that that's what I was telling myself when I was crying in the grocery store aisle looking for the formula. But in retrospect, I think there's an accountability that we have to demand from our government as citizens, and also an accountability that our government and all of the, organizations and regulators have to us, as citizens.
What kind of impact is this crisis having on vulnerable families, communities of color? Is the administration doing enough to address this side of the issue?
I think that the impact that it's having is truly profound. Some of the advice that we've been getting is switch formulas. And we know that as moms and parents and caretakers, it's not that easy to switch formulas. My daughter in particular, like I said, was on a sensitive formula. I switched her. It led to, significant stomach issues, a hunger strike, if you will. So I can only imagine what other communities who maybe don't have as many resources as I have, were vulnerable communities and parents with newborns, teeny tiny newborns, how they're feeling. I don't know that this is going far enough. And if not far enough, it definitely isn't going there soon enough.
All right. TiffanyAnn Goodson, wishing you all the very best. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Now, as we just heard, the Biden administration has come under fire for not responding sooner to the shortage, which critics say should have been anticipated. Last September, FDA inspectors made their first visit to a manufacturing plant in Michigan, operated by Abbott Nutrition, one of the 4 suppliers that control almost all of the baby formula market in the United States, and concluded that the facility was, quote, not in a clean and sanitary condition. Following reports of a sick infant who consumed formula produced at the plant, the company, which controls over 40% of the US formula market, shut down in February and issued a recall for all its products after 4 babies were hospitalized with bacterial infections. At least 2 babies died, although the company says there is no evidence that its formula caused any of the infant deaths or illnesses. Now, during a congressional hearing last week, the FDA commissioner was admonished by members of Congress from both sides of the aisle for his agency's slow response to the shortage and for its failure to address a whistleblower complaint of contamination at the plant. That report was first received by the FDA in October, followed by more reports of sick babies in early December and mid-January. It took the FDA until the end of January to inspect the Abbott facility again.
This supply inadequacy did not happen overnight. Across the industry we regulate, we are seeing evidence that the just-in-time distribution system market concentration, and sole source contracting are leading to shortages. Multiple reports to Congress call for improved supply chain management. Until regulatory agencies have digital access to critical supply chain information and personnel to do the work, we'll continue to react to supply chain disruptions rather than intervening to prevent them.
But should the FDA have done more to prevent this crisis? I'm now joined by Peter Pitts, a former FDA Associate Commissioner. Peter Pitts, there's obviously plenty of blame to go all round for this baby formula shortage, but should the buck stop with the Food and Drug Administration, the FDA, for not doing more to avert this crisis when there were red flags raised over 7 months ago? Did the FDA fail to do its job? Should it be held accountable for this massive failure?
There's a great Japanese proverb which says, don't fix the blame, fix the problem. There's plenty of blame to go around. However, one thing is clear. This factory needed to be closed down. Safety issues, quality issues. It would have been regulatory malpractice for the FDA to let this factory stay open.
But this goes beyond the one factory, though.
Well, it really doesn't. This one factory manufactured almost 40% of the entire US baby formula supply. One of the problems was once the FDA closed the factory and went to work to help Abbott remediate the problems, it didn't reach out aggressively to pediatricians or retailers or parents. So they could have known what was going on. And I think in the US, one of the great lessons of COVID-19 is that when the government tells the public the truth and they're transparent about it, even though the news might not be good, people appreciate the honesty and they trust the message. Part of the problem now is the FDA didn't communicate, in my opinion, robustly and often enough. And the result was a lack of trust in the FDA.
But did the FDA do anything about the problem early enough? Because it failed to properly address a detailed 34-page whistleblower report that was sent to it in October. There were also alarming reports of sick infants and fatalities. Is there any mitigating factor that can absolve the FDA of this mishandling, of this gross negligence?
Sure. Had the whistleblower report been addressed quicker, we would have been through the problem quicker, but we would have had the same set of issues. Fortunately, the children that were injured and 2 died, which is tragic. Those have not been tied directly back to the Abbott product, but lack of evidence is not evidence of absence. We still need to look. The FDA really needed to do a better job, but they were limited based on the authority they have from the federal government, and that's got to change. They don't have enough inspectors. They don't have the authority to request information. And at the end of the day, they simply didn't know enough soon enough. And that's a question of resources.
But how do you change this, though? I mean, are these corporations, Abbott and others, putting corporate profits well ahead of food safety and security? Does the FDA need a massive overhaul of its food safety division?
The way that you make sure that companies do the right thing is to inspect them regularly and robustly, and also offer surprise inspections, and also have regular open lines of communications. At the end of the day, being in compliance is expensive, but it's the cost of doing business. And I think it is unforgivable that Abbott, no neophyte to the baby formula industry, allowed their factory to become so lax when it came to safety and quality protocols. And that's really only because they didn't feel they were going to get caught. And for a long time they weren't, but finally they did. And that's why we are where we are now.
But should the FDA put so much in the hands of one company? Well over 40% of all production was left in the hands of this one company.
Baby formula is a high volume, low margin business. And that means you really can't make a profit being a small operator. What we can do is take off, for example, the 17.5% tariffs we have on foreign baby formula to incentivize more foreign baby formula coming into the US. We need to make sure that the manufacturers in the US are up to snuff when it comes to safety and quality protocols. They've got to do what the FDA expects them to do. And again, we need to make sure the FDA has the authority and the manpower to do more regular and robust inspections.
What about the responsibility of the Biden administration? President Biden himself said that he would have had to be a mind reader to respond quicker to the baby formula shortage. Did he have to be a mind reader to recognize the problem and act on it much, much earlier?
When you shut down a facility that makes 40% of the US baby formula supply, you don't need to be a mind reader. You simply have to know how to read. I think it was embarrassing that the president said that. He should have known that this was going to cause a shortage. Now, whether or not he was even told is unknown, and that requires some investigation. When did the FDA inform the Secretary of Health and Human Services and went to the secretary and informed the president. That's an important timeline for the American people to know. That's another problem that needs to be fixed.
But this is a problem that's been brewing well before the Biden administration. Obviously, you can't pin it all down to his administration, can you? It's a structural problem that many administrations have passed down decade after decade.
Well, we don't know right now how long that facility was out of spec. And it's not a question of blame. It's about understanding what happened so we can make sure it doesn't happen again. And the problem was this factory went offline because of quality problems that never should have been allowed to happen. The company should have known better. The FDA should have been in there more regularly. So we could have prevented the problem from happening in the first place. And that's the next step here. How do we put procedures in place to ensure that the problem doesn't happen again?
How do you ensure more honesty, more transparency as a former FDA official, and now more accountability?
Well, I think just for starters, the Abbott company needs to suffer the consequences of its actions. They need to pay a huge fine. I think some people should probably get fired and others might have to go to jail. This is a very serious infraction, against the health of our most at-need population, infants.
You're saying heads should roll. Are you saying heads should roll at the FDA? Are you calling for the leadership to resign?
No, I'm calling for leadership resignations at Abbott, the company that allowed these projects to happen. The FDA can't do what it doesn't have the authority to do or doesn't have the manpower to do. And it would be irresponsible on the part of Congress not to give FDA greater authority and more resources to ensure that these problems can be dealt with expeditiously and ultimately not happen at all.
All right, Peter Pitts, former FDA Associate Commissioner, thank you so much for being with me.
My pleasure. Thank you.
The shortage of baby formula brings to the fore an issue that has long plagued the United States: monopolization. Many key sectors of the economy, baby formula included, are dominated by a handful of companies, some of which receive additional preferential treatment in the form of tariffs that prevent widespread imports of the products they produce domestically. While the issue recalls an earlier period in U.S. history during which successive presidential administrations sought to break up massive steel, oil, and tobacco companies belonging to wealthy Americans like John Rockefeller and Andrew Carnegie, the problem remains. Today, just 4 companies control 90% of the baby formula market, and 4 companies control 85% of the beef market, while only 3 companies control 78% of the pasta market and 3 companies control 72% of the cereal market. Some are calling for tougher antitrust regulations to break up those monopolies, but will Congress take any measures to rein in the market power of these corporations and break up their virtual monopolies? J.D. Scholten is a congressional candidate in Iowa and a senior advisor to the American Economic Liberties Project. He joins me now. J.D. Scholten, it's quite extraordinary when you consider that about 90% of baby formula production in the United States is in the hands of just 4 corporations. One company, Abbott, controls over 40% of the baby formula market here in this country. How do you explain that, and why haven't there been any antitrust regulations to prevent this kind of virtual monopoly?
Well, what we've seen is 4 decades now of major mergers happening without antitrust enforcement on the level that we needed to. And so this baby formula, I feel, issue is a canary in the coal mine on a much larger scale on what's happening with the American economy. And so it's been very difficult for, I live in Iowa, and we're one of the 6 states that were drastically affected by and impacted by this shortage. And so it's one of the things where in America, we're the wealthiest country in the world, and yet we're having baby formula shortage. And it's something that is very, it's something that our economy is showing our vulnerability because it's being so concentrated. We lack flexibility, and ultimately things like this happen.
But how do you fix these structural problems with the economy?
Well, I think it starts with enforcing our antitrust laws. When you have just a few corporations dominating the whole market, if one plant goes down like it did in Sturgis, Michigan, it disrupts the entire market. And we saw the same thing actually in beef, the beef industry with the Holcomb fire in Kansas back in 2019. And one plant went down and it disrupted the entire market in the United States. And so there's different pieces all throughout our economy that are just very vulnerable. And so one part of what I'm trying to push for is more flexibility so we become a more secure economy.
More flexibility and tougher antitrust enforcement and regulations. I know this is what you've been pushing for, but how do you rein in the market power of these corporations? How do you break up these monopolies?
Well, you look at the incentives they have to grow, and everything in our economy, from the tax from tax law to other areas, it's get big or get out, and that's the way our model is right now. And so, for me, one thing I would like to do is reform the tax law too, to not incentivize how big they need to get, because ultimately, what hurts it's the American people, it's communities like where I live, that the wealth just gets extracted from, and in the lack of reinvestment. And so we're seeing that dynamic play out both politically and just in our economy, where there's a lot of frustrations. And in places like where I live, we haven't bounced back since the 2008 economic crisis, let alone anything recent.
It's, as you say, the concentration of wealth, and it isn't just the baby formula market. A handful of drug companies control the pharmaceutical industries. 4 giants control over 80% of meat processing. Same with the airline industry. Just 4 major carriers, Wall Street, 5 major banks. There's corporate concentration and concentration of wealth everywhere you look, and corporate profiteering. As a current candidate for the Iowa State House of Representatives, what can you do? What would you do as a lawmaker to change all this?
Well, I think we need to have a more regional economy. I think that's very clear. We need to decentralize some of this power. I think one of the major part of the issue is, let's change campaign finance reform. Let's get the money out of politics on a much larger scale, because right now that's part of it too, where the reason why a lot of these corporations and industries have been able to go through regulations and do their own thing and continue to be massive is because they can write huge checks to a lot of the political parties and all this.
But
and
realistically, that's not going to happen, is it? When it's in the hand of the very same lawmakers who are opposed to this.
Ultimately, it's the FTC and the DOJ that have huge responsibilities right now, and there's been signs of optimism in those areas where they have this potential to really do something that hasn't been done in decades, and I think it's much needed.
Finally, are we beginning to see sort of the slow end of unchecked capitalism as we know it? Is this putting capitalism into question?
Well, I think we need to have, when we talk about capitalism, we need to add another element when it talks about whether it's in our environment and environmental protections. We also have to have flexibility as part of it. And so if we just have capitalism just doing what it wants, it's going to end up in monopolies. It's clear. It's happening right now. It happened 100 years ago. And the reaction we had 100 years ago was enforce our antitrust laws, focus on building the middle class. And right now, that is not happening. We are too concentrated, and it's going to make our economy extremely dangerous.
J.D. Scholten, great to have you. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
The baby formula crisis in the United States, which has already triggered the use of the Defense Production Act, a wartime law passed by the U.S. Congress in 1950 to address the shortage in industrial materials during the Korean War, is just the tip of the iceberg. The Defense Department's so-called Operation Fly formula, using military aircraft to airlift hundreds of thousands of formula bottles from a U.S. airbase in Germany, has helped the Biden administration come to the rescue of several thousand American infants and toddlers. But it will not address their long-term needs, nor will it treat the much deeper symptoms that this crisis has exposed: America's monopoly problem and what many progressive lawmakers like Senator Bernie Sanders call corporate greed. This crisis has highlighted the dangers of leaving 90% of the U.S. baby formula market, a $55 billion industry, in the hands of just 4 corporations, a virtual monopoly that extends to every other key sector of the U.S. economy, including the airline industry, banking, telecoms, and pharmaceuticals. A handful of companies now own and control a growing part of the economy with no outside competition. The main incentive is to maximize profits, often cutting corners with little scrutiny or oversight. And now, with corporate profits at a 70-year high and inflation at its highest level in 40 years, the pitfalls of unchecked capitalism are reminding us of what Karl Marx warned about almost 200 years ago: capitalism's evil effects on society and how it would ultimately lead to its own collapse. And so, in short, the massive baby formula shortage in the United States has uncovered America's long-festering chronic socioeconomic disorder and its underlying conditions, an old monopoly problem exacerbated by concentration of wealth and corporate greed. That's all from me, Ghida, Fakhry, and the team. Thanks for watching.